بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. أما بعد, this is our sixth session discussing the book The Crusades Through Arab Eyes by the renowned author Amin Malouf, the French Lebanese, who relied exclusively on Muslim sources while writing this saga. This is the Firangi occupation of our Bilad al-Sham, exclusively written through the Muslim sources. This is why we chose this book to discuss. Last time we stopped at the very tense situation whereby Aleppo was on the brink of being surrendered to the Firanj. Damascus, under the leadership of Tukhtukin, the old man, the old Utabik, who had made quite a strong reputation for himself in the Levant, but he was now on his dying bed, and the Nizaris, whom we discussed last time, they had very good relationships with the Firanj, and it was assumed that as soon as the Utabik dies, Damascus would be surrendered by the assassins who had a strong presence in his court to the Firanj of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so it was a quite tense situation, either in the north of Bilad al-Sham or in the south of Bilad al-Sham. So this chapter starts with one high note, which is that one of the main reasons of the autonomous of Bilad al-Sham in general was the fact that the Seljuks and the Fatimids, whom had been both weak at the start of the Firangi campaigns, this allowed the rulers, the local rulers of Bilad al-Sham, to gain and keep and preserve their autonomy quite a lot. And this was a featuring trait for the next maybe 200 years or something like that, until the Mamluks gained the upper hand, the gains of the Sultanate of Egypt, and then they made it clear that their reign would be including of Egypt, some parts of eastern Libya, all of the Bilad al-Sham, the Hijaz, and maybe even parts of Yemen. But between the Firangi occupation and even before the Firangi occupation, for a while before the Firangi occupation, during the Firangi occupation, and all the way until the Mamluks established a strong presence or established their own ruling dynasty, so to speak. They weren't a dynasty, but their own, state. Bilad al-Sham had very strong, had a culture of autonomy for every city. So every city would be the ruler of every city would be more or less autonomous. We will see that this situation might have changed for a while during some famous rulers' reigns like Nur al-Din Mahmud or Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, but those guys were the exception and not the general rule. So the weakness of both the Seljuks and the Fatimids enabled the local rulers of Bilad al-Sham to always maintain a high sense of autonomy. And before we delve into the next chapter or the next phase of the conflict between the Muslims and the Firanj, first of all, we need to give the brave son of Tukhtukin, Buri, his due, because this prince was able to single-handedly save Damascus from falling to the Firanj on the eve of his father's death. So this was the son of Tukhtukin, and he was a man of the age, so to speak. He had a strong military capability. He had a strong intelligence. This intelligence apparatus was able to discover the conspiracy set up between the Firangi and between the Firangi and the Nizaris, and this conspiracy entailed that the Firangi would be delivered Damascus in exchange for giving the Nizaris Tyre. And so Buri acted quickly and vigilantly to kill the Nizari sympathizers in the court, and then unleashed a terror campaign against the whole sect in Damascus, whereby many of the Damascenes killed them. And this was maybe the first time the people were not so afraid of the sect, because as we mentioned last time, you couldn't even speak up against the Nizaris in public, because the very next day you would most likely be assassinated in public as well. So this may have been the first time that the Damascenes were able to exact the revenge against the Nizari sect. Of course, in these kinds of situations, there are, of course, innocent lives being, being killed on both sides. But it is an unfortunate event that took place. but it also shows how much people really hated the Nizaris and really hated their ideas and really hated their sect, that the moment they had the ability to exact revenge, they took it without hesitation. Um, then Buri, after having cleansed the city from the Nizaris, he focused on what could have been the largest Farangi army assembled since the first Farangi campaign. And it had come from all of the occupied lands: Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa. And this army was now surrounding Damascus. So Buri, he didn't panic. He called upon some Turkish and Arab tribes in the Levantine desert. He added them to his own corps and then conducted a sortie on a couple of thousand Farangi soldiers looking for food at the Ghouta Valley, which surrounds Damascus, one of the best, irrigated places in Bilad al-Sham. And Alhamdulillah, it was a complete rout, and the rest of the Farangi withdrew from this campaign. And when Baldwin II, the king of Jerusalem, when he next tried to attack Damascus, he faced terrible weather conditions and he had to retreat. And so Damascus was safe for the time being. Buri, on the other hand, he didn't live long enough to enjoy his victories, because one day after these events, two Turkish dwellers came in to Damascus, and they came to him looking for a job in his court. And as soon as his guard was down, they stabbed him, and they turned out to be the Nizaris. So this is the part where we were talking about last time, that they were easily able, they could easily able to they could easily infiltrate any regime, any public spaces, any kind of of assembly. They could easily infiltrate it, which means that they had very high capabilities, both in terms of intelligence, in terms of mimicking the guards of the emir, or the tabik, or the prince. They could do almost anything to blend in. And I think this was one of the perks of the famous game, The Assassins, that they were very keen on making the main character, whoever the character was, the assassin was, making them be able to blend in the masses without being noticed. So Buri now was dead, okay, and again Damascus was on a whirlwind. But now we shift the camera to Iraq, because now the strongest sultan who had come since the death of Malik Shah, Sultan Muhammad, or not only the strongest, but also the longest reigning. Sultan Muhammad, he was dead, and he was now succeeded by his teenager son Mahmud, a 16-year-old, I think. And Khalifa al-Mustarshid, sorry, Khalifa al-Mustadhir, the first Khalifa to witness the Firangi occupation, was now also dead, right? And he was succeeded by his more dynamic son al-Mustarshid. Now we are in a phase where people are born into the Firangi occupation. They're not just they weren't alive when the Firangi came. No, their whole life was they started their lives and ended their lives probably in the Firangi occupation. So this is what you could call a new generation of rulers right now, right? So al-Mustarshid, the son of al-Mustadhir, he was more dynamic than his father, and he was anxious to revive the golden days of his forefathers, the famous Abbasids, right? He wanted to regain the Abbasid autonomy. Not sure how he came to this, to this wish, because it's been more than 200 years it's been more than 200 years since the last Abbasid Khalifa was more or less autonomous. So sometimes you have to be more realistic in your approach to governorship and to rulership, to know your limitations and to know the current situation and how things are really on the ground. Anyway, al-Mustashid rose up against Sultan Mahmud, and Sultan Mahmud also wasn't that strong, or at least wasn't as strong as his father, and he had to ask for the assistance of the new Utabik of Mosul, Ahmad ad-Din Zenki. We have now Ahmad ad-Din Zenki, one of the most capable military rulers in the history of Islam, to be honest. So now Zenki and Sultan Mahmud, they were able to defeat al-Mustarshid, and peace was restored in Iraq. And in exchange for Zenki's efforts, he was awarded Aleppo. So now he had both Mosul and Aleppo. Now pay attention to this detail, because this is the very foundation upon which the next famous ruler, Nuruddin Mahmud, his son, would operate. Nuruddin Mahmud and his brother. So you had to have a very strong line of communication between Mosul and Aleppo, a strong presence in both cities, because Mosul was rich, It had the ability to amass soldiers, while Aleppo was logistically important because it was your um, launch pad to launch campaigns against the Falange in Bilad al-Sham, right? But before that, we need to take a step back and to try to like discover a bit the history of Ahmed al-Din Zinki, right? Who is Ahmed al-Din Zinki? Ahmed al-Din Zinki was the son of a very important figure called Aqsunqur. And Aqsunqur was a man who was very, very, very close to the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah. So this was one of the old guard, you could say, right? A man from the old days. He was a great companion and a close companion, a great man and a close companion to Malik Shah, the Seljuk Sultan, the great Seljuk Sultan. And Malik Shah, they had a very strong relationship that he uh, gave Aqsunqur the title of Qasim ad-Dawla, right? So Qasim ad-Dawla roughly translates in English to a partner in state affairs. Yani, he is partnering with me in running the affairs of state, which is a very high title in the great Seljuk era, especially because Malik Shah, as we mentioned, was the last great Seljuk Sultan, and so when he gives an Amir or a Notabic or whatever the title of Qasim ad-Dawla, he means that this man is running the state with me. So this is no small man. This is no small figure. This is a very important man in the Seljuk Sultanate. In fact, this friendship, this very close friendship, led Nizam al-Mulk, maybe one of the not the very bright, one of the not very bright instances in Nizam al-Mulk's life. Nizam al-Mulk felt that Aqsunqur's influence in court on Malik Shah could be problematic, and thus he suggested to Malik Shah that he appoint Aqsunqur to the governorship of Aleppo. Now we take the camera or switch the camera to Aleppo. Guys, remember this is before the Farangi occupations or the Crusades. This is way before, right? This was in the maybe the very not the very end, but the last quarter of the 11th century. The Farangi occupation started in the 12th century, in the very last year of the 12th century, but this took place maybe 25 years before. So at the time, Aleppo was being fiercely fought over by two guys. Sulaiman ibn Qutalmish. This man is the father of the famous Khalid Arslan, the Roman Seljuk Sultan, the guy we met at the very beginning of our story, the guy who lost his first capital but was able to inflict severe damage upon the Faranj in the next campaigns that they orchestrated. So this is his father. This is the founder of the Roman Seljuk dynasty. And the other guy Aleppo was being fought over by was the famous Tutush ibn al-Parsalan. So Tutush ibn al-Parsalan is actually the brother of Malik Shah, and also he is the father of the famous Ridwan and Duqaq. So as you can see, the main characters that we have been introduced to in the very beginning of our story, maybe the first, second, and third chapters, right? So this episode is like a flashback. We're now talking about their fathers. We're relating events concerning their fathers. So this is sort of a flashback episode. So Sulaiman and Tutush, they were fighting over Aleppo. Yes, Ustad.
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt your flow of the chronology and going through the book and everything, but I sort of wanted to clarify for everyone who's listening now. We're not going through the history just so that you can learn this history, and it's not just a dry history lesson. You have to understand that any outcome, a victorious outcome or a defeat, there's a whole architecture behind that. That all gets built up over time. And what we're trying to do is understand that these things are built, that outcomes are built over time by multiple ingredients, multiple layers, multiple players are involved, and you have to try to understand how all of these interactions take place and all of these various steps and stages that contribute to the ultimate architecture of what is your outcome, what outcome you achieve, what outcome you build. And so we're when we look back at the time of the Faranj invasion and occupation of our lands, you should be able to propel your mind forward to now, and then look at what's going on now through the eyes of a historian of the future. This is the future historical analysis approach that we take at Middle Nation. So the purpose for all of this, the purpose for going through this history, and even going back to reading about the Sirah, is to look at all of the stages and the steps and the measures and the actions and the players involved who are contributing to building a particular outcome. And this book really helps for anyone who hasn't been familiar or who isn't familiar with the history uh, to go sort of step by step all of the interlocking pieces that had to come together over the course of generations. As brother said, we're now having people being born under the French occupation, the existence of the French in our lands. Now you have leaders who have lived that their whole life, just as we have generations of people who have been born and who have lived and who have died during the Zionist occupation in Palestine and during the whole, all of us alive today basically were born during the time of American domination of the globe. So you should be able to try to propel your mind forward by looking at what happened in the past, to review events today in how they play, how it constitutes parts being interlocked, parts being put together, stages happening, measures being taken, all in the process of building an architecture that will lead us to an ultimate outcome. This is the purpose of this whole exercise, this whole going through the book and going through the history, is so that you can build that mental capacity and those intellectual muscles and those intellectual habits and techniques for understanding and interpreting what's going on today. We're not just giving you a sort of a dry history lesson about the past, but look at when brother is going through all of those events, look at it and understand all of the things that had to come together and all of the things that occurred, and then the responses to those things that occurred, those events, and understand that that is a process that is perpetually taking place, and it's taking place right now in our lifetime. And architecture is being built for an outcome that our children or our grandchildren or our great grandchildren will inherit because of what the people are doing now, because of what leaders are doing now, because of what populations are doing now, because of what people in various fields are doing now. All of those things come together to build an outcome, just as it did back in the time of the French invasion. Jazakallah khair. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all, Ustad. I think it's a very it's a very brilliant point to be raised actually, and we're trying to add some some explanatory points as we go, like the point you mentioned when we said that a new generation of rulers is now born into the Farangi occupation, and there's also the fact that, for example, the part where we said that the Bilad al-Sham rulers were now autonomous. This is a fact of yeah, this is a fact of life back then. So people had to deal with that in addition to their dealing with the Farangi occupation, right? So you can't just come in, and this was, I think, apparent last time when we mentioned when the Seljuk Sultan Muhammad sent a campaign to discipline the Muslim rulers of Bilad Sham, Tuftuqin and El Ghazi. So what did they do? They allied with the Farangi. So this meant that you never ever cross their autonomy if you want to solve the problems in Bilad al-Sham. This was a lesson learned by the Seljuk Sultan Muhammad. And so it's a learning process, but you cannot disregard the situation on the ground. It's not how things are done. If you want achievements, you have to do what you can with what you have. So yes, we're not just relating stories as much as we want to try to extract lessons from those stories to understand how those people operated, the thought process, and how we can reflect that on our current age and our current era, inshallah ta'ala. And now, so we mentioned that Aleppo was being fought over by two strong men. يعني, this is very, we need to state that again, Tutush ibn al-Prasalan was the brother of Malik Shah. So this is the brother of the Sultan. And Sulaiman ibn Qatalmish was his cousin, his paternal cousin. So again, this is a very high-ranking prince in the Seljuk family. So those two wanted to establish, no, I wouldn't say mini states, but they wanted to establish breakaway states in Bilad al-Sham. For Tutush, he wanted to make a Seljuk state in Bilad al-Sham under his dominion, and Sulaiman ibn Qatalmish wanted to create a breakaway state in Asia Minor, or back then it was called Ard al-Rum, or the land of the Rum, the Eastern Romans, I mean. And so that's why they took the name later, Roman Seljuks, right? So Tutush had his capital in Damascus, and Sulaiman ibn Qatalmish had his capital in Nicaea. And this made Malik Shah a bit worried, and sending Aqsunqur to this to this region, which is the border between Asia Minor and Bilad al-Sham, it seemed like a good idea because he wanted someone there to balance the power between Suleiman ibn Qutulmash and Tutush. And so not only that it was يعني نظام الملك, like he was not trying to make a bad move in Malik Shah's mind. No, in Malik Shah's mind, it seemed like a good move because he really wanted someone he could trust. And mind you, يعني, we have to remember this was Qasim ad-Dawla. This was his close companion, his very close friend. So he was sure of his absolute loyalty if he was able to hold Aleppo and establish some sort of balancing of power in the region. So the battle over Aleppo between Tutush and Suleiman resulted in Suleiman's death. And when Malik Shah arrived to settle matters himself, so Malik Shah, so this was how severe the situation had been, right? The great Seljuk Sultan had to come all the way from Asia, from the depths of Asia. So the capital of the Seljuks was in Isfahan, right, somewhere near Qum and modern day Tehran and that kind of thing. So it was a distance to be covered. It wasn't like he was in the Hijaz or the Bilad Sham. No, he had to cover a great distance because the Seljuk Empire was indeed um, large. So Aksunkur, when Malik Shah went to settle matters for himself in Bilad al-Sham, Aksunkur was assigned to Aleppo, and Qilij Arsalan, the young Roman Seljuk Sultan, whom we met later in the future in our first episode, he was sent to Isfahan, where he was raised in the court of Malik Shah, and he was kept, in safe hands because Malik Shah didn't want to have a sultanate of the Roman Seljuks established in Asia Minor. So this kid had to be sent away to Isfahan to keep that from happening. But as we know, in the future, after Malik Shah's death, Khalid Arsalan was able to escape from Isfahan and he went to Asia Minor and he did establish the Roman Seljuk Sultanate as his father dreamt. Now, Tutush remained in Bilad al-Sham, and it's understandable because, again, this was the brother of the Sultan. So the Sultan didn't, punish him because this was his brother and he was a high-ranking prince in the Seljuk family. And so Tutush remained in Bilad al-Sham and he fought the Fatimids over the cities of the coast, because until this point in time, the Fatimids, they were a strong presence in Egypt. They had a very strong fleet that could serve their presence in Egypt. And so holding the coastal cities was a challenge for Tutush. And we see that until the Firangi occupation in the early 12th century, the Fatimids still had coastal cities in their hands. So, as we mentioned, the the Fatimids had coastal cities in their hands until the first Firangi occupation. Now, Aksunkur was able to fairly rule Aleppo after a series of unjust rulers who had ruled the city. He restored public safety, he revived trade, and in a nutshell, his reign was a golden reign for Aleppo, and the Aleppans would always remember him, and we would see that play out in the future, or actually in this episode. So after Malik Shah's sudden death, expectedly, there was a power grab, right? Tutush, the brother of the Sultan, made a bid for the throne in Asia. Against who? Against Berk-Yaruq, the son of Malik Shah. So now Aksunkur had to make a choice. Either side with Tutush, the stronger man, the older man who had capabilities, military capabilities, I mean, or side with the son of his close friend and competent. And of course, Aksunkur sided with Malik Shah. And of course, when he fought Tutush on the field, he lost to Tutush and he paid the price with his life, right? So Aksunkur was killed in this incident. Now, when Aksunkur died, he had a 10-year-old, Zenki, right? And Malik Shah's son, Berk-Yaruq, the current sultan, who was still, trying to survive, he never forgot Aksunkur's loyalty, and he took in Aksunkur's 10-year-old son, Zenki. And then Zenki had been in the service of the famous Utabiks of Mosul since he could manage, since he could ride horses, as soon as he could ride horses and be of use. He had been put in the service of famous Utabiks of Mosul, such as Qarbuqa, Jakarmish, Jawli, and even Al-Bursuqi, Aksunkur al-Bursuqi, another Aksunkur, I mean. So Zenki always put his loyalty to the Seljuk sultans before all else. And this was a very important aspect of his understanding of the dynamics of power in the region, right? Because now we were no longer in the age of the great sultans, the great Seljuks, and there was a Khalifa anxious to revive the glory of his forefathers, we had the Firanj, we had the Roman Seljuks. So we had breakaway states everywhere, which meant that he had to choose wisely and consciously whom he would side with in any conflict, right? So Zenki's service to the different Utabeks of Mosul gave him enough experience to hold the position in 1127 when he was around 40, right? So he came after al-Bursuqi. So after al-Bursuqi and his son died, when he, if our listeners will remember, Aqsunqur al-Bursuqi and his son, they were assassinated by the Nazaris in Aleppo in the series of assassinations executed against them, against Qadi al-Harawi, al-Qadi al-Khashab, before them, Sharaf al-Din Mawdud and al-Tuntukin. So they were the last, perhaps, in a series of assassinations that almost depleted the region from strong, capable rulers. So Zenki, when he was the Otabek of Mosul, he was not like his predecessors in the governorship of Mosul. He had a vision for the region that involved him building an autonomous state. So he was no different from the rulers of Bilad al-Sham in that aspect. And he also had a vision where the Faraj occupation was nowhere to be seen in his lifetime, at least. He had a very strong court. He was famously strict with his soldiers, and his army was also known to be uniquely disciplined in the region. And this will play out in how he ruled Mosul, because the people of Mosul didn't, didn't they didn't complain from his rulership, and the people of Aleppo also didn't complain from his rulership. He led a rough life. He didn't sleep in palaces, but he slept in tents. He was always on the move, and he was always on alert. And this shows us how dynamic this character was. So before him, the Otabeks of Mosul, the only goal they had in mind was to come to Bled Sham, launch some campaigns here and there, gain some loot and gain some spoils, and return back to Iraq, because this was the center of power, Iraq and Asia. Zenki, on the other hand, had a different vision, as we mentioned. He wanted to establish a strong presence in Bilad al-Sham, and he wanted to establish a long-standing presence. And we will see how this played out when he was succeeded by his sons, especially Nur-ad-Din Mahmud, because Nur-ad-Din Mahmud was later on called the Sultan of Bilad al-Sham, right? So he didn't have much relationships with Asia, except with friendly relationships with the subjects of his time, but his main power base was in Bilad al-Sham. So we discussed the positives of Mediddin Zenki, but he also had some misgivings, right? So he, for example, before Buri died, he asked Buri of Damascus for aid in a campaign against the Faranj. But when Buri sent his own son Sawanj from Hama, which was held by the Damascus, along with 500 knights, to aid Zenki in his battle with the Faranj, Zenki held them hostage, those 500 knights and the prince Sawanj, the son of Buri. He held them hostage and threatened Buri not to challenge him. And Sawanj was released 2 years later, right? So, of course, Hama was empty, didn't have any soldiers and no leader, because they were held hostage by Zenki. So he was able to capture Hama with the help of the leader of Homs. And then he tried to do the same thing with Homs by imprisoning its leader, but the city held out against Zenki, and he lifted the siege. Now, those two incidents gave the Damascus an idea about the character of Zenki, right? So Zenki didn't have any qualms resorting, to deceit and treachery, trying to establish his power base in Bilad al-Sham. And this gave Damascus its long-standing strategy with the Zenki and with his son Nuruddin Mahmud. So this is a lesson in also how to understand that the actions you make right now, they may have long-standing effects, not only in your lifetime, but in the lifetime of your sons and your successors in a region as on fire as Bilad al-Sham. The reason why Zenki wanted to take Damascus was that Damascus was rich in its strategic importance, and it had two valleys very important in Zenki's mind to supply him with grain. In addition to Aleppo, of course, Zenki tried to control as many lands between Aleppo and Mosul as possible, because he wanted to create a homogeneous, continuous state between his power base in Mosul, his earlier seat of power, and Aleppo. So the lands in between, the cities in between, like Mardin, Diyarbakr, that's why I sent the map in the discussion group. So please feel free to either add it here, or go back to the discussion group and view the map. So the lands between Aleppo and Mosul, they had to be in Zenki's hands. Otherwise, he could be having the two cities, but he would be unable to move freely between them, between his seats of power, and that would hinder his efforts greatly, either in Iraq or in Asia Minor. Either in Iraq or in Bilad al-Sham. Like, Zenki also had a strong intelligence apparatus that informed him of what happened in Baghdad. So the Abbasid Khalifa, Isfahan, the Seljuks, Damascus, which is the family of Tukhtukin or Tabuk, Antioch, the Faranj, Jerusalem, the Faranj, and of course Aleppo and Mosul. So he had a strong intelligence apparatus. He was not surprised that much. He knew everything before it happened. So when he first took control of Aleppo, he didn't go there, right? He left it. He left it under one of his generals, since he was drenched in the power struggle in Iraq, the one we mentioned before we delved into the story of Zenki and Zenki's father. So as you guys remember, Al-Mustarshid was still trying to break away from the Seljuks with Iraq, right? He wanted to establish a strong state in Iraq, uh, breaking away from the Seljuks. So when Sultan Mahmud died in the power struggle, Al-Mustarshid again wanted to rise up. So he was defeated the first time around when Sultan Mahmud asked for Zenki's aid. But when Sultan Mahmud himself died in the power struggle between the Seljuks and themselves, Al-Mustarshid again wanted to rise up. This time, when Zenki again decided to face Al-Mustarshid in battle, Zenki was defeated. He was almost captured also, if it weren't for the help of the governor of a city called Tikrit. This governor of Tikrit helped Zenki and made sure he arrived safely back to Mosul. This man, the governor of Tikrit, is called Najmuddin Ayyub. And our speakers already know this man and know who he is. Our listeners may not know him right now, but please remember this name, Najmuddin Ayyub. You probably know, but I don't want to break the surprise. So Najmuddin Ayyub was able to successfully save Zenki from falling into the hands of the Khalifa al-Mustarshid, and thus he essentially saved Bilad al-Sham from total deliverance to the Faranj, because this was the strongest man in this time, Zenki, I mean. So the successor of Sultan Mahmud was his brother Sultan Masoud, and Sultan Masoud convinced al-Mustarshid to attack Zenki in Mosul, and at the same time, this Masoud helped Zenki secretly. So he was trying to establish again his own power, Masoud. And when al-Mustarshid did lay siege to Mosul, he was unable to take it, and he was even killed in his own tent, right? So we see that Iraq was a bit on fire, and this hindered Zenki's efforts to be totally focused on Bilad al-Sham. But also, there was something else taking place in Bilad al-Sham, which was remarkable, in my opinion, that the same political divisions that were consuming the Muslim rulers were now working their way into the Farangi campaign as well, right? So when the ruler of Antioch was killed by the son of the famous Danish band, the Turkish ruler of of a part of Asia Minor, and we also met him at the beginning of our story. So when the ruler of Antioch was killed by this famous Danishman's son, the widow of the ruler of Antioch, she was the daughter of Baldwin II, the king of Jerusalem, and she was his daughter from an Armenian Middle Eastern princess. This meant that this princess was a native, right? So she took matters into her own hands, and she decided to seek Zenki's assistance in exchange for nominal allegiance to Zenki, right? So she wanted to be autonomous in Antioch, but under the over-rulership or the overlordship of Zenki. This was the new generation of Faranj who were born in the Middle East. They had never been in Europe. They had never been to Europe. And many of them, like the daughter of Baldwin II, they were children of Eastern Christians and Armenians. Of course, Baldwin II intercepted the messenger that this princess had sent to Zenki, and he banished his daughter from Antioch. It is important also to note that despite having spent some time in the region, many of the old Faranj still cling to their old habits. This, of course, meant a lack of hygiene and an alarming lack of ghira towards their wives. And there's nothing to say here, to be honest. What else can I say? No hygiene and no ghira. I mean, anyway, so this meant the lack of hygiene part especially meant that many of the children died young. And of course, this had its own implications because this caused a problem of succession. And also, there was the factionalizing took place when Baldwin II was succeeded. So when he died, his daughter was married to someone called Folk, who came from Europe. But this daughter, the wife of Folk, she had an affair with some count in one of Jerusalem's many, smaller cities. And so a factionalizing took place because some people sided with Folk, the successor of Baldwin II, and other people sided with the lover boy. I mean, I wonder what a Muslim ruler would have, thought when he heard that kind of news. Anyway, after Buri's death, his son Ismail, so this is the grandson of Tukhtukin, his son Ismail was up to a promising start, but after he discovered a conspiracy against his own life, and after he interrogated the culprits himself, he went on a killing frenzy. And so no one was safe, not even his brother Soanj, the one who was held hostage by Zenki when he was sent from Hamad by Buri, right? And this again tells us, so you could be a good ruler, the people could be actually blessed with a good ruler, but maybe some of them have some issues with this ruler, so they decide to act, and this alone could cause chaos. So Ismail, as we mentioned, he was up to a promising start. He was able to attain some cities from the Falange, but because some people didn't like some of his policies in Damascus, they decided to act up, and so he became this obsessed maniac with this conspiratorially obsessed maniac, and he was suspicious of everyone, and so he decided that I'm going to kill everyone. Not only did he decide that he was going to kill everyone, but and the more people he killed, the more he became afraid. So it became like a closed loop. He can't exit it because he killed people. So those people would have some people wanting to exact revenge on him. So he killed those as well, and yeah, it was a wrong, of course, decision on his part. So the more he killed, the more afraid he became. So afraid Ismail had become that he wrote to Zenki asking him to come to take Damascus. Of course, Zenki, I think when he heard that, he was like, let's march right now. Let's take the army and march right now to Damascus, right? But before Zenki arrived to Damascus, Ismail's mother, along with the Damascus elite, had killed Ismail and had prepared for a long siege against Zenki. Because Zenki's earlier treachery was still ringing loud. So they, to a Damascus, anything was appropriate or anything can be accepted except having the overlordship of Zenki. So this is the part where we said that some actions taken by some people could have long-standing effects. So this is the end of chapter 6. I hope we covered everything. We also supplemented some of the information we had by explaining Zenki's background and the power grab that took place after Malik Shah's death. If any of our speakers have anything to add, I'd be more than happy.
I was saying, I just want to follow up what Ustaz was saying about how what it actually takes to build, power. When you look at these events in isolation, like for example, Buri, like when he was slaughtering the assassins, I was thinking, imagine you're living in that time period and you're seeing the ruler just unleashing violence on the population, and you'd be like, oh, he's so cruel, he's unjust, he's a tyrant, we need to get rid of him. But you look on it on a long enough time frame and you see the irreversible damage the assassins have unleashed on the Muslim world. So yes, they have created irreversible damage against the Muslim world, and so the decision to deal with them would obviously have to be ruthless. It does not look pretty. But again, on history remembers differently. On a long enough time frame, you can see the rationale behind these decisions. The same thing with Ahmad ad-Din Zenki. Malouf doesn't romanticize him; it does not paint him in a good way. But nonetheless, he was the first model of someone who actually engaged in disciplined statecrafting and state building. But again, if you lived during that time, you would have considered him ruthless, questionable, un-Islamic, etc. The same things that they say today. But again, history remembers differently, and he's done incredible work, and his son did incredible work.
Yeah, actually, on that point, I think there might be something right here to to discuss, which is yes. First of all, we need to determine that the only reason we say that Ahmed ad-Din Zenki did some unquestionable things is that we as Muslims have a very high standard of criteria, right? So our criteria are very high and they are always Islamic and ethical. But if we take away those criteria and view the events from a real politic objective entirely without any other ethical backgrounds, this would be a man who is like the one of the best statesmen in the era. The only reason we say that is that we have, as Muslims, we have our own calibrations of how to think about things, right? And we say still, real politik is real politik. What had to be done had to be done, and that kind of thing. But when we, for example, compare to other Muslim leaders, like, for example, Nuruddin, his own son, or Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, we see that other actions like towards Damascus or towards other cities in the Bilad al-Sham were taken, which were different from Zinki, and they had a better outcome. So we can make that sort of comparison. We can make, or we can say that this was not the best move, because we will see how Nuruddin, for example, was able to acquire Damascus. We will see how Salah ad-Din Ayyubi was able to uh, construct his own state in Bilad Sham and in Upper Iraq, right? So those two had different approaches from Ahmad ad-Din Zinki, and they were successful. So of course, Ahmad ad-Din Zinki was the first, but when we view history in its entirety, we will see that some people made the wrong decision, some people made the right decision, some people made a decision that delayed some events, and some people were able to learn from those events and make the right decision afterwards. So it's a continuum. It's an organic state building process. It's not something that no one knows what will happen in their own lifetime.
Barakallahu feek. I just wanted to comment on something that Abdurrahman mentioned. That is, it's interesting when you consider what we read in the book. So he mentioned that, the massacring or the takedown, let's say, the removal of the assassins, the Baltani, the Nizari, that this would have been, from an outside perspective, maybe seen as something cruel or brutal, etc., etc. You can have a negative slant on it. But when you read the accounts of Al-Qalanisi and the people involved there, they seem to have welcomed it. And so this is just one of those things that in that time, and even in present day times, it can be very tempting to put on the lens from outside, from externally, and judge without, or even perceive and quote unquote analyze without the context of without the internal context, the local context that is critical to understand what is happening, why it's happening, and how it's being received. And you will see this play out in all sorts of different geopolitical events, including what's happening right now in countries, where from an outside perspective, it might be seen as, well, why is that happening? Oh, this is brutal. Oh, look, they said peaceful, and now they're launching this sort of airstrike and this sort of thing. But if you ask the people that are there, perhaps they have a very different outlook on what's happening, why it's happening, and are welcoming it. And so it's just one of those things to keep in mind that I think was very telling in the account that Amin Marnouf put together. He may not have shared it that way, but that's what I perceived from it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Anyone else want to add something? Brother Kareem?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
What just stood out to me, and it's just something maybe like a general lesson, but you can see it's not written by a Muslim because he always somehow exposes some sins of the rulers. And I think we need to learn, okay, we expose crimes of Muslim rulers, but we should always cover up the sins, because we all sin. And part of being, a Ghaffar is to try to cover up the mistakes of our rulers. So, subhanAllah, when you read the Sirah, or when you read the stories of the Sahaba or different narrations and so on, it really does not focus on the sins of individuals, but the author always has to mention, and I feel like it has no further point, it doesn't really add anything to the story or to the outcomes of anything. But this type of I have to mention something negative, I don't know, I just feel it's unnecessary, and that we should, be cautious of repeating the same with present times, right? Like, we can, of course, talk about crimes, talk about injustices, talk about, breaking the law and so on. But whenever it comes to individual deeds regarding exactly, there are not, good deeds, we should try to cover up of our brothers, and, we would want the same, right? Like, we don't want anyone to expose our mistakes and our sins. So we should always try to cover up for our brothers, and that applies, to family, and it applies to rulers and all Muslims that we know of. So yeah, that was just something that stood out to me. But again, I know that it doesn't add anything to the historical narrative, but it just got up on it in the different chapters that we read, that always, this was drinking, this one was doing, this one was okay, so what, like what is the point? What are you trying to say? That Muslims do this stuff, or like, right? So just something that I think we need to be cautious about, and whenever we criticize someone, we have to criticize on apparent crimes and not based on individual sins that people might commit.
Thank you so much, Brother Kareem. I think that was it was actually a good addition to the discussion in terms of how we can view our rulers and the rulers of the past, the criteria upon which we make our judgments. Brother Hadaifa, I saw your hand raised up.
No, if you will allow, just from the standpoint of just extracting benefits from what we're reading in contemporary context as well, I really appreciated the point that our beloved brother Kareem just mentioned there, because it is definitely something to keep in mind, the bias of the author that we're reading. And I know it's something that I mentioned earlier as well, that he feels a need to criticize Ibn al-Athir, for example, and he does this consistently with things that don't even really necessarily add to the narrative. Now, in some situations, I can see where, for example, heralding Ahmad ad-Din az-Zingi and how different he was, or Zinki as he was from some previous rulers, it makes a little bit of sense in a historical context to just showcase how different he was in his demeanor or in what he was doing. But I do think it's very important when we talk about trying to analyze geopolitically that there's nothing from our Dean just talking about what lens we use in his story in understanding the events. There's nothing that would suggest that rulers magically are removed from the descriptor and the protection of being brothers in the Deen, and so they are also owed. They have a right over us of husn al-dhan, for example, of good assumption, and of covering certain things, and of not delving into internal affairs. And you will see how the hatred for certain rulers and leadership spills out into talking about personal private affairs that have nothing whatsoever to do with geopolitical events and managements. And so this becomes very important, even to the point that it calls for consistency in the way that we perceive things. I just recently saw a speaker, a scholar sitting in America, who, when he was talking about a personal affair, something between him and another sort of da'wah bro, he was very firm about the principle of this is a brother in Islam, he deserves good assumption, and he really applied that well. This same speaker I have seen, may Allah bless and preserve him, may Allah guide him as well, and forgive him and all of us for all of our wrongdoings. I have seen him be very, very critical on personal matters about the sinning of certain rulers. And he has even removed them from the fold of Islam at times for things like this. So this becomes something that I think this was a very important point, and I think it's something that we can extract benefit while reading this historically, but also apply it contemporaneously. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam.
Thank you so much, Brother Hadaifa. Yes, Brother Kareem.
Yeah, I just want to add the point that, people do not consider the implications of doing that. They think they might be, exposing something and hurting that specific person, but they do not understand that other people who listen to this or read it are like, oh, okay, so if the ruler is doing it, then, it's okay. Like there is this sense of complacency that comes with it, right? Like when you expose the sins of others or make sins public and so on, it becomes sort of normalized, right? But that is not from our deen, right? We try to conceal these things and treat it as it should be treated, right? That's something that is serious, right? It cannot be taken public, and it cannot be done like something, let's just accept that it's normal, everybody does it, and chill out. The rulers were drinking, so it's okay if you sometimes drink. Like okay, they did other good things, we remember them well, so it must mean that it's okay, right? No, it's not okay. Like there are certain things that become sort of again, as I said, normalized when it becomes public, right? Which is a big implication that I don't think the people who criticize these things have in mind when they say it, right?
Yeah, and this is again, returning us to the fact that people they try to confuse the public aspect with the private aspect. So when Al-Khashab called Al-Ghazi to take Aleppo when he was in Mardin, Al-Ghazi was known to be a drunkard and all of that kind of thing. But Al-Qadi Khashab, the Al-Qadi means in English the judge, the Muslim scholar, right? So this Muslim scholar had no qualms bringing up someone who he knew might have been a drunkard to take the city, because when he compared the two situations, he thought that him having the city or him not having the city, he found out that him having the city would protect the city. So it was good for or beneficial for the the entirety of the Muslim population of the city, even if the man was not the perfect emblem of a Muslim ruler. So what they do in their private, in their private times is their own business. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're not condoning it, we're not saying that this is okay, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will exact judgment upon them on the day of judgment. But what we do expect is that the rule is beneficial to the ummah, to the Muslim ummah, right? And if the rule is beneficial to the Muslim ummah, then that is what we care about in the long game. Does anyone else want to add something?
I don't know if it's safe for me to talk. I don't know if you'll be able to hear me or not. Can you hear me?
So far, so good.
Okay, alhamdulillah. There's a few things that I wanted to say, as I said, or I tried to say. I think part of it was covered already by Brother Abdurrahman. But with regards to any sort of moral or ethical judgment about Ahmad ad-Din Zengi and his actions, I think it's important for everyone to consider timelines that any particular actor is working on. And it was known that he had a long-term plan, a much more cohesive vision than anyone else at that time for what he wanted to accomplish. And so the decisions that he was making were based on that long-term plan for what he wanted to achieve. He actually had a vision for a Bilad al-Sham with no French in it. He actually had a very long-term vision for a total victory against the French. And the decisions that he was making were based on that horizon. So that's something that has to be considered, especially when you're talking about political leaders. With regards to his personal shortcomings, who cares? No one is asking you to marry him to your daughter. He has a job to do, and if he is qualified for that job, then that is all that you need to evaluate about him, are his qualifications and his skill set for the job that he is required to do. Like I said, we're not talking about we want this man to marry our daughter, but do we want him to lead the charge against the French because he's capable of doing that? Do we want him to be in a position of rulership? And then the other thing that I would say, although we haven't gotten into it yet, he had a very righteous son. So whatever you want to say about him as a man or as a Muslim, somehow he ended up having an incredibly righteous son who really paved the way for what eventually took place, the eventual victory that took place, and who almost single-handedly was able to reframe the entirety of the conflict as a religious conflict over the course of his life and over the course of his reign. I don't want to jump ahead to that, but there's a lesson to be taken from that, aside from even the lesson about the personal shortcomings of someone or the perceived perception, the perceived shortcomings that a person may or may not have. There's the fact that you can think whatever you want to think about Ahmad ad-Din Zengi and his possible ethical lapses or his questionable moral judgment, whether you're talking about his personal life or in his political decisions. But what he was able to accomplish by the means that he accomplished it, even questionable though they may be, what he was able to accomplish was inherited by someone who was more righteous than him. It was inherited by someone who had a greater Islamic vision, a more moral vision, and he was given, or his son was able to inherit what he built. And that's something that we really need to remember now. That there may be leaders now that we don't particularly like, that we don't particularly approve of, that we wouldn't marry to our daughters, for example. But the fact of the matter is they are building something that will inevitably be inherited by someone else, and it will be inherited potentially, as we've seen in history. We have this example, this beautiful example of Imad al-Din Zaki and his son Nuruddin, of what was built by someone of maybe questionable ethics or questionable morals or questionable tactics. What was built by that person was inherited by someone who was better than him, who was more righteous than him, who was a better Muslim than him and a better believer than him. And that was beneficial to the entirety of the Ummah, and it led to the ultimate victory against the French. So these are all things that have to be considered when you're looking at, as I said, when we're looking at this history, this chronology of events, and how the parts were being put together over the course of generations. We're going through that same process now, and it's an ongoing process always. So that's why I always talk about how we should look at today with the eyes of a future historian and see that what is being built is being built. You may or may not like the people who are doing it. You may or may not approve of their leadership or their moral qualities or their Islamic commitment and what have you. But once the thing that they're building has been built, once that architecture is there, it will inevitably be inherited. And inshallah, bi'idhnillah, will be inherited by better people, more righteous people, and that will bring benefit to the entirety of the ummah, just as what happened in the days in of the book that we're reading now. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant example, Ustad, both in terms of comparing, because we have to remember that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam also made decisions, like he would use people who may not have even been Muslims when he was departing from Mecca to Medina. The guide he used was not a Muslim, but he knew the job. He knew how to navigate the routes between Mecca and Medina in unfamiliar paths, unknown to the Quraysh, which eventually had the dawah as a whole, right? So this meant that you can use people who are not even Muslims to achieve the goals if they know or if they can get the job done. So, and moreover, you can, and this more than that, it applies. The case more than that applies to the fellow Muslims who have their own, shortcomings. So I think this is a brilliant example, and also the fact that you never know, maybe in the future, a better ruler, a better politician, a more Islamic character can come up, as Nur-ad-Din succeeded his father. So the bricks are not always put by the right people, but the bricks are put. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has his own way of doing things. And in the meantime, we always have to work on ourselves, because Nur-ad-Din Mahmud was a son of his environment. He was a man of his environment. He learned in the madrasas. He learned he had scholars for his teachers. I don't want to burn away, as Steph said, but his upbringing was essential in how the conflict was being framed in his own mindset and in his campaign, both in terms of military and propaganda. I'm so sorry, I'm spoiling, but it's just that Ustad brought up some important thing. And also we need to know, I know Brother Hudayfa has something to add. This will be my last point, inshallah, then I'll give him that Nizam al-Mulk, the vizier, I always say vizier, the vizier of the Seljuks, this guy established something called the Nizamiyat, right? The madrasas throughout the Seljuk Empire, in Baghdad, in Bilad al-Sham, in Asia. Those madrasas were the places where the next generation of rulers, because those madrasas took time in order for their produce to be ripe, and for the men who came out of them to be able to have an effect on the stage of political events. So those madrasas were the launchpad of how there was an Islamic renaissance during the time, where we now can see scholars, praising jihad, bringing up Muslim rulers who are focused solely on retrieving Bilad al-Sham from the Faranj and that kind of thing. So this was a brick put by Nizam al-Mulk that didn't have maybe an impact during his lifetime, but later on, many generations later on, when the Nizamiyat were, a matter of fact on the ground, they were able to produce leaders like Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and that kind of thing. So bricks are important, patience is important, and at-tadarruj, which is like, step-by-step processes take their time. Yes, Brother Hudayfa?
No, I'm just a slightly different tone of example, but in similar vein, the notion that there will be at times things that in present day you will do that may be met with what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, subhanallah, articulation has left me. La ilaha illallah. That may be met with some sort of conflict or some sort of resistance is the word I was looking for. Some sort of resistance, because maybe people at the time are not seeing the grander vision. But this is, as Sheikh Shahid was just mentioning, it takes a certain visionary type, and it takes the ability to look beyond and act as, okay, if this is to take fruition, what will the future look like? To then understand the validity of this and the merit of it. And this happens throughout our history. This has happened many times. When we look back, we'll notice that at that time there was some resistance, but alhamdulillah that it happened. Two brief examples that come to mind, and just don't react heuristically to the examples, because one may think that, hey, these are very different people we're talking about, but the examples are what I'm just calling to. One is of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu ta'ala an, who collected and compiled all the different recitations of the Quran into a mushaf, because he could see the pitfalls arising of people not being upon the same thing and potentially reciting from different masahif. And then also the example of the great giants of hadith like Imam al-Bukhari, and I'm just mentioning him because he's one that we all will know from Sahih Bukhari, but even people that paved the way before him, who at their time, there was a little bit of resistance to the notion of even writing down hadith because it was something that was always memorized and kept in the hearts. But had they not done this great effort that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has preserved, we may not know any hadith today. So it is just two brief examples of this notion that we have to have a little bit of patience and be willing to extend the timeline, as our beloved Ustad mentioned, and look at what are the outcomes going to be of this and how will that benefit the ummah thereby.
Yes, Hudayfa, thank you so much for that. If anyone else wants to add anything before we wrap up, inshallah. Yes, Brother Abdurrahman.
Yeah, subhanAllah, speaking of visionaries, I was just thinking about this hadith for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he told us that whoever disapproves of something done by his ruler, then he should be patient. And that's just and yani, subhanAllah, yeah, when you just be patient and you look at things on a timeline, on a longer timeline, things fall into place, things make sense, even the questionable acts, the questionable rulers. But I think the issue honestly stems from this idea that everyone is accountable to you as an individual, you know, the ruler, the government, everybody is accountable. Like imagine you're a receptionist at a company and you think the CEO is accountable to you, or you don't think the CEO is doing a good enough job, and you don't even have the slightest idea of what they're going through, what their options are, what they're dealing with, what pressures they're going. And we talked about this earlier in the previous sessions, but I want to bring it up again, and it's Muslims and this being nostalgic to this utopian history that they don't really understand. They think this Islamic history of just these rulers who are uncompromising, who've never sinned in their lives, who've never done anything wrong. And it's today here in the 21st century that these Arab rulers, you know, these evil Arab rulers are undoing all this Islamic work. But you look at their history and you can see no shortage of questionable behavior. No short, and if these things happen today, if you apply the same standards, I can't imagine wallahi their action to some of these things. But yeah, and I think that's what's really important about this book discussion, is because we're seeing the reality of Muslim history unfold through our own lens, through our own sources.
Yes, alhamdulillah, and I hope it is going to be beneficial, inshallah, in terms of how we view ourselves, how we view the rulers back then and right now, and understanding geopolitics and how we can look at the longer game, inshallah. All right. So there's an ayah that's been shared by Brother Kareem in the chat that I want to share and close with it, inshallah. وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ. Surely following the heavenly record, we decreed in the scriptures that my righteous servants shall inherit the land. This is an ayah from Surah Al-Anbiya, ayah 105. So I think it is nice to close the discussion today with this ayah, because it refers to the fact that that Ustad Shahid said that maybe the bricks aren't put by people that we don't really like, but someday people we really like will use those bricks. So we will see the effort paying off, inshallah. And with that, thank you all the speakers for adding and for commenting and for being there. A huge thank you for the listeners for staying up all that long. And we will be discussing, inshallah, Zenki's campaigns a bit further next time. Not this next Saturday, but the one after, inshallah. We will also encourage the listeners to join the group, to read the book, to see the notes that we put, to discuss, to see the maps. If anything is missing from there, please be sure to engage. And as Ustaz said before, we don't give the mic to anyone. We have some sort of middle nation criteria that we need our speakers to adhere to, and we have to know you beforehand. So forgive us if we don't give the mic. It's not a free for all. We're different in that aspect from most spaces on it. Thank you so much, and see you inshallah next time. Assalamu alaikum.